Remember when GLP-1 medications first exploded into mainstream conversation, and everyone seemed to have a strong opinion about them, often based on half information, dramatic headlines, or a single scary story someone heard from a friend of a friend? A few years into widespread use, we now have real data, real research, and real clinical experience. And it turns out a lot of what we all assumed about these medications, both the fears and some of the hype, needed serious correction. Today, I want to walk you through what the science actually shows now, separating the genuine concerns worth taking seriously from the myths that simply haven't held up under closer examination. Stay with me, because this is exactly the kind of nuanced, evidence-based conversation that actually helps you make informed decisions rather than decisions based on fear or hype. Welcome back to VitaRoot Health, the channel dedicated to cutting through health misinformation and giving you the real, current science behind the topics that matter to your body. Every video here is built on genuine research and expert insight, not sensationalized headlines. If understanding what's actually true about your health matters to you, make sure you're subscribed before we dive into this one, because the GLP-1 conversation has evolved significantly, and it's worth getting caught up properly. Let's start with the fear that dominated headlines for a long time. The idea that GLP-1 medications cause dramatic, alarming muscle loss. This concern wasn't invented out of nowhere. Early observations did show that some portion of weight loss on these medications came from lean tissue rather than purely fat. And that's a legitimate physiological reality worth understanding. But here's what we got wrong. The scale of that concern was significantly overstated in public conversation. As one endocrinologist put it directly, the idea that you'll lose 30 to 40% of your muscle mass on these medications simply isn't accurate, and that kind of exaggerated framing represents poor guidance rather than reflecting the actual clinical reality most patients experience. Newer evidence has consistently shown that the majority of weight loss through GLP-1 medications comes from fat mass, not muscle mass, which is a meaningfully different picture than what circulated in the early wave of public concern. That said, and this is important, this doesn't mean the muscle conversation should be dismissed entirely, because nuance matters here more than a simple yes or no answer. At the 2026 American Diabetes Association Scientific Sessions, this exact question was the subject of genuine, lively debate among leading researchers. One perspective, presented by a professor of medicine and nutritional science, argued there's no strong evidence that GLP-1-induced weight loss causes frailty or sarcopenia in the general population, since the majority of weight loss is fat, not lean tissue. The opposing perspective, presented by a director of a nutrition and obesity research center, acknowledged that while there's little evidence of harm in otherwise healthy individuals, genuine concern remains for specific higher risk groups. This is exactly the kind of honest scientific disagreement that gets lost when headlines flatten complex research into simple, alarming claims. So, who exactly falls into these higher risk groups worth genuine attention? Research has specifically flagged concern around midlife and older women, since this population is already at elevated risk for losing muscle mass and bone density as a natural part of aging, meaning any additional muscle loss during treatment deserves closer monitoring rather than dismissal. Similarly, broader research reviewing multiple clinical trials has found that these medications can be associated with reductions in bone mineral density at certain skeletal sites, with the specific concern being that the real-world effects on physical function and fracture risk in older adults, a population increasingly using these medications, remain genuinely unclear and warrant continued research attention. Now let's talk about what happens when people stop taking these medications, because this is another area where the popular narrative got seriously oversimplified. It's true that research shows people commonly regain a significant portion, often around 2/3 of the weight they lost after discontinuing GLP-1 medications. What often got lost in the retelling of this fact is an important nuance about what that regained weight actually consists of. Multiple sources of research now indicate that the weight that returns after stopping these medications tends to be predominantly fat, rather than the muscle and bone that may have been lost during treatment. This matters enormously because it reframes the entire conversation. The concerning pattern isn't simply weight cycling in a generic sense, it's specifically that someone can end up with a body composition that includes less muscle and bone than before they started, even if their total body weight eventually returns to a similar number on the scale. This is exactly why the medical consensus has increasingly shifted toward framing GLP-1 medications as a long-term commitment rather than a short-term intervention, similar in some ways to how we think about managing other chronic conditions like high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes. Many people who discontinue these medications within the first year, specifically because they assumed it would function like a temporary fix, are the ones most likely to experience significant weight regain, precisely because the underlying physiological drivers of excess weight typically haven't been fundamentally changed by a short course of treatment alone. Let's move to what's actually right, the strategies that genuinely make a meaningful difference for people using these medications, because this is where the science has become considerably clearer and more actionable. Protein intake matters enormously during treatment, and this isn't a vague suggestion. There are specific, research-backed targets worth knowing. Experts generally recommend consuming somewhere between 1.0 and 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of your ideal body weight daily, drawing from sources like lean meats, fish, eggs, dairy, tofu, and legumes. Since these medications work by significantly reducing appetite, it becomes genuinely easy to underconsume protein simply because you're eating less food overall, making intentional protein-focused meal planning considerably more important than it might have been before starting treatment. Resistance training is the second major piece of this puzzle, and multiple experts have described this as non-negotiable rather than optional. Strength training at least 2 to 3 times per week has been specifically identified as vital for stimulating muscle growth and preserving lean body mass throughout treatment. This isn't about becoming a bodybuilder. It's about giving your body a genuine reason to hold on to and build muscle tissue, even while you're in a caloric deficit driven by reduced appetite. Another myth worth addressing directly is the assumption that everyone should experience similar, predictable results on these medications. Comparing your own progress to someone else's experience creates unrealistic expectations and can lead to unnecessary discouragement. Someone in your life might lose 15 pounds in their first month, while you lose only 4, and that difference doesn't necessarily mean the medication isn't working effectively for your specific body and circumstances. Individual metabolic factors, starting body composition, dosage, and countless other variables all influence the pace of results, and treating someone else's timeline as the standard you should be hitting is a genuinely unhelpful comparison trap. I also want to touch on something that's actually improved significantly since these medications first gained widespread attention: accessibility and cost. In the earlier days of GLP-1 popularity, affordability was a major, legitimate barrier for many people who could genuinely benefit from these medications. Advancements in the field, alongside the growing availability of alternatives to the original leading brand name medications, have made these treatments considerably more affordable and accessible than they were just a few years ago, which represents genuine progress worth acknowledging, rather than a myth that needs correcting. It's also worth understanding something important about muscle loss during any significant weight loss process, not just with GLP-1 medications specifically. This pattern of losing some lean tissue alongside fat isn't unique to these medications at all. Any method of substantial weight loss, whether through calorie restriction, bariatric surgery, or medication, typically results in some degree of lean mass loss as part of the process. In some cases, researchers have even noted that changes in muscle composition during weight loss may actually reflect improvements in muscle quality itself, including reduced fat infiltration within muscle tissue and improved metabolic function, rather than simply representing pure loss. So where does this leave us in terms of practical, evidence-based takeaways? First, the extreme fear-driven narrative around catastrophic muscle loss on these medications was genuinely overstated, but the underlying concern isn't baseless either, particularly for older adults, women in midlife, and anyone already at elevated risk for muscle and bone loss. Second, protein intake and resistance training aren't optional add-ons. They're genuinely essential components of using these medications safely and effectively. Third, these medications work best when approached as a long-term strategy, paired with sustainable lifestyle changes, not as a short-term fix. You can simply stop once you hit a target number. And fourth, comparing your individual results to someone else's experience serves no genuinely useful purpose and often causes unnecessary discouragement. Before we wrap up, I want to be completely clear about something important. This video is meant to help you understand the current state of the research and separate genuine concerns from exaggerated myths, but it's not a substitute for a direct conversation with your own healthcare provider. If you're currently using or considering using a GLP-1 medication, your specific health history, particularly around age, existing muscle and bone health, and other individual risk factors, should absolutely shape your personalized treatment plan and monitoring approach. That brings us to the end of today's deep dive. If this helped clear up some of the confusion around what we actually know now about these medications, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this information reach more people navigating this exact topic. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these myths surprised you the most, or if you've had personal experience with any of what we covered today. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to VitaRoot Health, because we'll keep bringing you the real, evolving science behind the health topics that matter most. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of your health, and I'll see you